March 3, 2026. A supermarket in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. A mother of three stood in the cooking oil aisle, staring at the price tag the way you stare at something that cannot possibly be right. She checked her phone. She checked the tag again. Then she quietly put the bottle back on the shelf. She didn't know why. She had no idea that 3 days earlier, on the other side of the world, fighter jets had begun screaming across Iranian skies. She had no idea that a 21-mile wide stretch of water she had never heard of had essentially stopped moving. She only knew that something, somewhere, had shifted, and that her grocery budget was no longer enough. That moment, a mother in Malaysia, a price tag in Kuala Lumpur, is the story of every war you think doesn't involve you. This is not a video about geopolitics. This is not a video about military strategy or who bombed what. This is a video about you. About the invisible strings that connect a missile strike over Tehran to the gas pump in Germany, the grocery store in the Philippines, the factory floor in South Korea, and the heating bill in Poland. Because here is the truth that nobody in the news is telling you plainly. This war does not need to reach your country to destroy your economy. It already has a head start. If this kind of global analysis is something you want more of, hit subscribe right now. This channel exists to explain the world in ways that actually matter to your life. Hit the bell. Let's get into it. Before we follow those invisible strings, we need to understand what actually happened. And the date that matters is February 28, 2026. On that morning, the United States and Israel launched what military planners were calling Operation Epic Fury, a coordinated strike campaign targeting Iran's leadership infrastructure, ballistic missile sites, nuclear facilities, and naval forces. The operation had been building for months. As far back as June 13, 2025, Israel had already struck Iranian nuclear and military facilities in a preliminary wave. But February 28 was different. February 28 was the full commitment. Within hours, Iran retaliated. Ballistic missiles and drone swarms flew not just at Israel, but at Saudi Arabia, at Qatar, and reportedly in the direction of Turkish airspace, where a NATO-operated air defense system had to intercept an incoming Iranian projectile somewhere over Anatolia. Turkey, a country that hosts American air bases while simultaneously maintaining diplomatic ties with Tehran, suddenly found itself standing directly on the fault line of a war it desperately wanted no part of. By March 1, sirens were screaming across Israeli cities. By March 2, Reuters reported that the top U.S. general had outlined the initial timeline of operations: Phase 1 targeted command and control, naval forces, and missile infrastructure. By March 5, CNN was running headlines that read everything we know on the 7th day of the U.S.-Israel war with Iran. 7 days in, and the world still didn't fully understand what it was looking at. What the world was looking at was the beginning of the most significant disruption to global energy markets in modern history. Now here is where most people's eyes glaze over, and where I need you to stay with me, because this next part is the mechanical engine of everything that follows. There is a stretch of water between the Sultanate of Oman and the Iranian coastline that is, at its narrowest point, approximately 21 miles wide. You could drive across it in less time than it takes to watch a movie. It is called the Strait of Hormuz, and through that 21-mile gap flows roughly 20% of the world's crude oil and natural gas every single day. Not 20% of a particular region's supply. 20% of the world's supply. Every day. When Iran threatened to set fire to any vessel attempting passage, the maritime world did not need to be told twice. Shipping giants Hapag-Lloyd and Master of Science suspended bookings from Persian Gulf ports entirely. Insurance underwriters, the unsung gatekeepers of global trade, began pulling coverage from any vessel daring to approach the strait. Without insurance, no tanker moves. It is that simple. And so, for the first time in living memory, one of the most traveled shipping corridors on Earth ground to something approaching a complete halt. The NPR headline from March 4 said it plainly: the Iran war has effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz. Now understand what that sentence actually means. Approximately 10% of the world's container ships were suddenly caught in the backups and rerouting chaos radiating outward from that closure. VLCC tanker rates, the massive supertankers that carry crude oil across oceans, shot past $400,000 per day. CMA-CGM, one of the world's largest container carriers, slapped a $3,000 emergency surcharge on every single container unit heading through the Persian Gulf. Oil prices jumped 10% in a single session, crossing above $90 a barrel for the first time in years. Traders at Bloomberg were issuing warnings that $100 per barrel was not a prediction. It was a countdown. Goldman Sachs published an analysis that stopped people cold. If the Hormuz disruption sustained for a full month, European gas prices could rise by 130%. Not 30%. 130%. And here is where I need you to ask yourself a question. Drop it in the comments right now. Where in the world are you watching this from? Whether you're in Jakarta, Lagos, Berlin, or Sao Paulo, I want to know, because what I'm about to explain hits every single one of those places differently. But it hits all of them. Let's follow the oil. When oil prices rise, the reaction is not contained to oil. Oil is the invisible ingredient inside almost everything you touch. The fuel that runs the truck that carries your food. The energy that heats the factory that makes your phone. The input cost that determines the price of plastic, fertilizer, pharmaceuticals, and paint. When oil crosses $90 a barrel and traders are whispering that $100 is imminent, that number doesn't stay at the refinery. It walks. It walks into the supermarket, into the gas station, into your electricity bill, into the price of every product that was ever shipped across an ocean inside a metal box. As of March 6, 2026, The Guardian was reporting that oil had hit its highest weekly gains since the COVID-19 pandemic. Not since the Ukraine war. Since COVID. To understand the weight of that statement, remember what COVID did to global supply chains. Remember the shortages. Remember the inflation. Remember the interest rate hikes. Now imagine that same pressure, compressed, arriving not from a pandemic but from a 21-mile choke point that one country has decided to weaponize. The Huffington Post laid it out for ordinary readers. Expect gas prices to rise. Shipping costs to surge the longer the conflict lasts. And don't forget tariffs. Certain household expenses were already climbing before the first missile fell on Iranian soil. The war is not creating those pressures from scratch. It is pouring gasoline on a fire that was already smoldering. Now let's talk about Europe, because Europeans watching this video may feel a particular chill. Europe began 2026 with lower gas storage levels than in any recent year. That is not speculation. That is a documented vulnerability going into winter replenishment season. When the Iran war erupted and Qatar, the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, sitting directly in the Persian Gulf, was forced to shut its gas fields due to the conflict, European gas benchmark prices spiked by as much as 45% in a single week. Reuters reported that those prices briefly hit their highest level since early 2023. Goldman Sachs issued their 130% warning specifically to European policymakers who were already scrambling to think through storage strategies. Bloomberg's analysis of European industrial costs was stark. Freight rates, which had eased toward historical lows heading into 2026, were being reversed sharply by the Hormuz crisis. European manufacturers were staring at 2026 cost inflation figures that nobody had modeled for. The Guardian put it with characteristic British directness in a headline from March 5. Globalization is under threat from the Iran war, and Britain is uniquely vulnerable. Uniquely vulnerable. A country with no direct military involvement in Iran, thousands of miles away, described as uniquely vulnerable. Because Britain's economy, like so many European economies, breathes through global supply chains. It breathes through shipping lanes. And right now, those supply chains are gasping. Across the continent, in Asia, the picture was simultaneously different in its specifics and identical in its direction. China imports slightly more than half of its entire seaborne crude oil supply from the Middle East. About a quarter of that comes specifically from Iran. When the New York Times ran its analysis on March 2 with the headline already weathering a trade war, Asia now faces a new energy crisis. The phrase trade war in that headline was not metaphor. Asian economies were absorbing the compounding weight of American tariff policies and a simultaneous energy disruption. Bloomberg reported that the popular investment thesis of Sell America, Buy Asia, which had attracted enormous capital flows into Asian markets, was being directly punctured by the war. Asian stocks were falling disproportionately because of that region's outsized dependence on Hormuz-routed fuel. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, these are industrial powerhouses that import essentially all of their energy. Every one of them was suddenly staring at energy cost structures that made their manufacturing models more expensive and their export competitiveness more fragile. Reuters was blunt about it on March 2. Iran conflict disrupts oil supply to Asian countries dependent on Middle East. India was reportedly in emergency diplomatic conversations about pivoting toward Russian oil as an alternative, a move that carried its own geopolitical complications, its own market distortions, its own downstream effects. Pause here for a second. Think about what you just heard. A war between the United States, Israel, and Iran is pushing India toward Russia, crashing Asian stock indexes, emptying European gas storage calculations, and raising the price of cooking oil in Malaysian supermarkets. And we haven't even gotten to food yet. Let's get to food. And I want you to drop a comment right now. Have you noticed any price changes at your local store in the past week? Groceries, fuel, utilities, anything. Because what's happening in the supply chain is about to arrive at your checkout line if it hasn't already. The thing about oil prices is that they don't just raise the cost of filling your car's tank. They raise the cost of making fertilizer. Fertilizer production is deeply, fundamentally dependent on natural gas. Nitrogen fertilizer, the kind that feeds approximately half the world's population indirectly through crop yields, is manufactured from natural gas through a process called the Haber-Bosch process. When gas prices spike 45 to 50% in a week, fertilizer manufacturers across Europe and Asia face an immediate and brutal cost increase. They pass that cost to farmers. Farmers pass it to food processors. Food processors pass it to grocery chains. And grocery chains pass it to you. Bloomberg's newsletter from March 6 carried a headline that deserves to be read slowly. Iran war's impact on Strait of Hormuz threatens fertilizer supplies, food prices. The Conversation published an academic warning titled How the Iran War Could Create a Fertilizer Shock, an Often Ignored Global Risk. Reuters reported on March 5 that farmers across Asia were already scrambling for fertilizer supplies ahead of the planting season. But here is the part of this story that breaks your heart if you let it. In sub-Saharan Africa, fertilizer use is already extraordinarily low. Farmers there operate on margins so thin that any increase in input costs means a choice between using less fertilizer or going into debt that cannot be repaid. The International Food Policy Research Institute published a warning in early March. A prolonged Iran conflict would choke global sea trade through the Persian Gulf, raising fertilizer prices and threatening food security for the most vulnerable populations on Earth. People who have never owned a car. People who have never flown on a plane. People who have never heard of the Strait of Hormuz. People who will eat less because missiles were fired over country they cannot locate on a map. That is not a political statement. That is a supply chain. Now let's pull back to the regional level, because the war is not staying contained to Iran's borders. And this is where the danger of escalation becomes terrifyingly real. On approximately February 28 to March 1, Iranian missiles and drones struck Saudi Arabia, struck Qatar, targeted infrastructure in the UAE. Pakistan, a nuclear-armed state with deep ties to both Saudi Arabia and historic diplomatic relations with Iran, found itself in an impossible position. By March 7, Pakistan's Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar was conducting what he called shuttle communication between Riyadh and Tehran, simultaneously signaling support for Saudi Arabia while urging Iran to exercise what he called wisdom and avoid miscalculation. Bloomberg reported on March 7 that Pakistan and Saudi Arabia had held discussions about joint security measures to halt Iranian drone and missile strikes. Saudi Arabia reportedly sent a direct warning to Iran: continue attacking the kingdom and Riyadh would permit American forces to use Saudi bases for expanded military operations. Dawn newspaper in Pakistan carried the headline that said it all: caught between Iran and Saudi Arabia, can Pakistan stay neutral for long? Pakistan, a country of 240 million people, a nuclear state, being pulled toward a war it did not start and cannot afford. And then there is Turkey, a NATO member, host of American air bases, a country that intercepted an Iranian projectile in its own airspace. Deutsche Welle's headline from this week read: Iran war sees US base host Turkey juggling Tehran, NATO ties. The word juggling is doing enormous diplomatic work in that sentence. This is how regional wars become global events. Not through dramatic declarations or formal alliances. Through incremental pressure on states that cannot absorb the weight of choosing a side, until one day, a choice is forced upon them. The financial markets understood all of this before most people did. Within 48 hours of Operation Epic Fury beginning, the S&P 500 began falling on what analysts were calling inflation risk from the Iran war. Reuters, on March 6, described investors clinging to shock absorber trades as economic visibility dropped to, in their words, zero. Morgan Stanley published an investor brief titled Iran Conflict: 7 Takeaways for Investors. The third takeaway was not subtle. Prolonged conflict would lead to higher oil prices, hotter inflation, and greater market uncertainty. Charles Schwab's FAQ on the Iran war contained one sentence that every person with a mortgage, a savings account, or a retirement fund should read: the risk of recession increases the longer energy supplies are disrupted, with larger impacts on Europe and Asia Pacific. Recession. Not slowdown. Not volatility. Recession. Because this is how the arithmetic works. Higher energy prices mean higher production costs. Higher production costs mean higher consumer prices. Higher consumer prices mean central banks face pressure to raise interest rates. Higher interest rates mean mortgages become more expensive. Business loans become more expensive. The credit that small businesses use to make payroll becomes more expensive. And the consumers who were already stretched by post-pandemic inflation and tariff-driven price increases suddenly find themselves simultaneously paying more for everything while their borrowing costs rise. Chatham House published a sober analysis this week acknowledging that even a long Iran war would have limited consequences for global GDP in aggregate. But they were careful to add the qualifier that certain emerging economies are profoundly vulnerable to persistent high energy prices. The aggregate number hides the human story. It always does. Let me ask you something. Drop a comment below. Do you think this war escalates further, or do you think diplomacy pulls it back from the brink? I genuinely want to know what people around the world are thinking right now, because the answer to that question determines everything that follows. In the weeks since February 28, 2026, something has emerged that no single headline can fully contain. It is a sensation that the interconnected world, the world of cheap container shipping, just-in-time manufacturing, global energy markets, and borderless digital finance, is being stress-tested at every single joint simultaneously. The war in Iran did not create these vulnerabilities. It revealed them. Every country that built its energy security on Gulf imports. Every factory that designed its supply chain around cheap ocean freight. Every central bank that assumed energy prices would remain stable enough to enable growth. Every family that structured its budget around last year's grocery prices. All of them are now sitting in the exhaustive decisions made in Washington, Tel Aviv, and Tehran by people who will not personally stand in the cooking oil aisle and do the math on what they can still afford. An analyst at a major investment bank, speaking anonymously to Bloomberg this week, put it with the kind of bluntness that never quite makes it into official reports. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, the Strait of Hormuz isn't a geopolitical problem. It's an infrastructure problem. And right now, 20% of the world's energy infrastructure is offline. 20% of the world's energy infrastructure. Offline. Let that land. The fertilizer prices will climb for several more weeks before they arrive as higher bread prices. The shipping surcharges applied in early March will take 4 to 8 weeks to travel through the container system and emerge as higher electronics and clothing prices. The oil price increase at $90 to $95 a barrel is already arriving at gas stations in Europe and Asia. The gas price spike in Europe will ripple into industrial production costs, into utility bills, into manufacturing margins, into the cost of the product you are planning to buy next month. None of this respects borders. None of this asks for your opinion on the Middle East. None of this checks whether you voted for the people who authorized the strikes. The market does not care about your nationality. The supply chain does not care about your politics. The price of fuel does not distinguish between the American taxpayer who supported Operation Epic Fury and the Bangladeshi garment worker who has never heard of it. This is the modern reality of an interconnected world declaring war on itself. The weapons are missiles and fighter jets. But the shrapnel is inflation, and it flies everywhere.